Hey everyone, Ben here again for a final edition of this round of Rosaries Rewind. We have in fact recorded a new episode that should be on your way soon, but to tide you over until then, here's Adam's conversation with the brilliant Robin Hanford from 2022, discussing what a more radical version of Remembrance might look like. I've left in the mind grapes on this one because although the stories themselves are quite old, sadly the points about transphobia and anti-asylum seeker rhetoric are still relevant and possibly even more relevant now. We're really excited to be back recording. We're looking forward to being back in your ears soon, but for now, please enjoy Rosaries Rewind, Remembrance, Redux.
So Abram rose and clave the wood and went, and took the fire with him and a knife. And as they sojourned, both of them, together, Isaac the firstborn spake and said, My father, behold the preparations, fire and iron, but where the lamb for this burnt offering? Then Abram bound the youth with belts and straps, and builded parapets and trenches there, and stretched forth the knife to slay his son. When lo, an angel called him out of heaven, saying, Lay not thy hand upon the lad, neither do anything to him. Behold, a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Offer the ram of pride instead of him. But the old man would not so, but slew his son and half the seed of Europe one by one.
Hello and welcome to Bread and Rosaries, a podcast about the UK, Christianity and the left. I'm Adam Spears, and if you're a regular listener, you may have noticed that I am not Ben Molyneux Hetherington. Unfortunately, Ben had to go into work at the last minute today, so I'm afraid you're stuck with me. I am, however, delighted to be joined by the Reverend Robin Hanford. How are you doing, Robin?
I'm good, Adam. How are you?
I'm pretty good. Thanks for asking. Robin, you are a Unitarian minister. Would you like to introduce yourself? What on earth is a Unitarian?
Ha ha ha! I should have prepared for you asking me this. And to be honest, I think many Unitarians probably don't know what a Unitarian is. But
that's true of a lot of denominations, to be fair, as well. So
it's completely true. So Unitarians, I would describe Unitarians as being on the extreme liberal end of Protestantism, and because of that liberalism, being open to insights of other faiths. And so we are extraordinarily diverse. So what one Unitarian believes might not be what another Unitarian believes, and that's because we're non-creedal, non-doctrinal, and yeah, so we just welcome a broad range of perspectives and think that religion is best sort of figured out in community. So yeah, sort of diverse, inclusive. If that's the kind of church you like, then you'll like Unitarianism.
What else is on my mind, Grapes?
The first story we've got is a sacked teacher who has apparently lost her legal bid, essentially to discriminate against a trans pupil. She initially refused to use the chosen pronouns and to support this pupil as the school was trying to, and the school's policy and the law required her to do. And then when she sought legal advice, she then shared information about that child and was then sacked for gross misconduct. As always with these kinds of cases, the Christian Legal Centre, which is an arm of Christian Concern, got their grubby paws on this and made it go further than it ever should have gone. I actually have some personal experience of this because I used to I used to work in a school, a particular kind of school, and we had a student there who was trans, and pretty much all of the staff team refused to call this student by their chosen pronouns. And I would try to explain to these people, we have a legal duty. You won't hear me, using the language of legalism very often. But in this kind of case, I absolutely will. We have a legal duty to use this person's chosen pronouns to support them in that. And it kind of just fell on deaf ears. And I actually ended up having to go and speak to the deputy head about it. And that's the thing about this, is that, first of all, this person, she had to do that. That was the law, which is obviously why she went to get legal advice, so she could just ride roughshod over this person's lived experience. But second of all, to say that trans rights in this country are being eroded. Mm-hmm. And it's not unforeseeable that soon this won't necessarily be the law, especially with it gaining more traction amongst people. Obviously, the obvious one is J.K. Rowling, and I think people are often surprised to find out that J.K. Rowling is a TERF, a trans-exclusionary radical feminist, but they're even more surprised to find out that she wears the T-shirts of and goes to the events of far-right anti-trans groups as well. So, not a good person, the biggest name at the moment, saying all this anti-trans nonsense, and that's a big part of the reason this kind of thing is gaining so much traction at the moment, and we have to oppose it at every turn.
Well, it's such a shame. Like, I have family members who have been very much sucked into this sort of anti-trans tribalism, and it's almost kind of like losing family members to a cult, really.
Yeah.
And I just think it's willful negligence on the part of some of them that, if the TERFs were kind of successful in what they wanted to do, would anti-LGBT backlash stop at that point? It won't, because they're combining with these far-right groups, this sort of US evangelical Christian funding. Like, if people allow trans people to constantly be attacked by this, then some people who have gone down this sort of anti-trans rabbit hole will actually find themselves on the hit list next and will be totally surprised at how that came to be.
Yeah, 100%.
And so that's a great shame.
It is. And the really sad thing is just how much this has become a mainstream talking point now. This is one of those ways in which you can fairly easily demonstrate that there are certain people who should not be given platforms. So much of this is being driven by literal fascists, and as you say, fascists are not going to stop there. And you can see that as well by the fact that a lot of the arguments that anti-trans activists use are the same arguments that were used against gay people in the 80s. And we've also got this thing now where there's an undercurrent within the LGBTQIA plus community. So, for example, the LGB Alliance, who are one of these fascist-adjacent organisations who oppose basically the existence of trans people. And the crazy thing is, if you look at Pride and how Pride started, Pride was basically started largely by trans people who were under attack by the police. LGB people as well, but trans people very much were involved in that. And it's just complete ignorance of history to try and exclude those people from the movement. And obviously, I've got to be careful because I say this as a straight man, but the facts of history speak for themselves, I think.
Well, I'm not a straight man, I'm a bisexual man, and you're right, Adam. Stonewall, trans people were at the forefront of that movement from that night onwards, and I think there's this weird perception that sort of trans people are like a sort of recent thing, and that's not the case. If you look at the sort of typical Western conception of binary gender identity, that is a recent thing in itself. In terms of human history, there's always been people who have not identified within the sort of modern binary gender categories. It's a sort of classic sort of media-driven moral panic And actually, as an autistic person, I've had people come to me and say, "Oh, if you're an autistic child nowadays, you would be transed." I know, and again, it's just nonsense. I think there's this fear that because society's attitudes towards LGBT people have changed a little bit, that there's going to be this sort of runaway exponential growth of people identifying as trans. That's not the case. Like, if you look at people who have been left-handed since educational policies changed to accommodate for left-handedness at school, that went up, but it reached a natural plateau at some point. And I think you'll see the same thing with the statistics for trans and non-binary people, that it will reach the natural plateauing where the vast majority of trans and non-binary people can come out of the closet safely, and it will plateau off from there. There's this idea that vulnerable people are being picked on to have gender reassignment surgery is this really conspiracy theorist load of bollocks. I'm going to call that what it is.
Absolutely. Well, I guess I'll move us on from that load of bollocks to another now, with our next story, which is that of a 66-year-old man who drove 115 miles from his home in Buckinghamshire to throw 3 petrol bombs at a Dover immigration centre before killing himself. 2 people received minor injuries, but the centre stayed open. It's a centre that processes asylum seekers arriving by dinghy, so that stayed open. But as we often see when the perpetrator is from the far right, Kent police initially declined to treat it as a terrorist incident, and then they reversed that decision after backlash and also after it became clear that this guy had a habit of posting racist and anti-migrant messages on social media. So the kind of anti-racist, anti-fascist kind of organisation Hope Not Hate, they said that they have recorded 165 incidents of activity from far-right and anti-refugee activists at immigration facilities so far this year. And they also accused the government of, and this is a quote, mainstreaming anti-migrant rhetoric and encouraging far-right groups to target asylum seekers and refugees. Which, I think, given the political theatre the Home Secretary's been engaged in recently, I think we could just take that at red at this point. This really should be a wake-up call, again, to ministers like Suella Braverman and Priti Patel before her, who have been, feeding what is far-right rhetoric for a long time now. We are seeing attacks against people just for trying to seek safety. And yes, we can be angry about the individual who did that, but actually, that's the line that these reactionary politicians and journalists want us to take. They want us to individualise this problem rather than seeing the underlying causes. So the MP for Dover, a woman called Natalie Elphick, she initially said that, and this is a quote, "The motivation was unknown." I'm from Folkestone, right, which is the next town along from Dover. So I keep an eye on local news from that area, even though I haven't lived there for some time. And I can tell you, Natalie Elphick is one of the most reactionary people in the Conservative Party, which is saying a lot given what it's like at the moment. But she is especially reactionary on this issue. So if she is unsure about this person's motivation, perhaps she should go and revisit some of her own words on this, because she has repeatedly tweeted about what she calls illegal entrants and infamously put up videos using incredibly inflammatory language to describe asylum seekers arriving by dinghy. And this is all because her party has closed down all the safer routes for seeking asylum. But the Tories are never gonna deal with that, right? That's against their rhetoric. So she's been feeding far right sentiment in this country for a long time now, And, you know, for her to outwardly wonder why there would be a terrorist attack targeting the same people she's constantly scapegoating takes some fucking gall. It really does. But this is the same playbook they all draw from, whether it's Priti Patel, Suella Braverman, or, you know, underlings like Natalie Elphicke. And by the way, successive prime ministers, right? They all do it. And it's deliberate. It's the way they all operate. And what it is, and I've said this on the podcast before, it's a form of stochastic terrorism. And stochastic terrorism is basically words like this that whip people up into a frenzy and make acts of terrorism more likely. You know, it's always the same with these people. And frankly, they've been getting away with this kind of dangerous, toxic bullshit for far too long, and they should all be held to account for it.
Totally. I mean, the conditions of migrants in these centres, I think there was a story in the press today about how people in these centres are regularly exposed to scabies, and I think diphtheria, something like that. You know, basically all of these weird diseases that you know you just don't.
You know, none of us would ever expect to get.
No,
you know?
None of us would. You know, unless you were like in some Dickensian novel.
Yeah,
I've got this morning's front page of the Telegraph in front of me, which I think came out before this. The Telegraph this morning led their front page with migrants side by side in hotels with public.
as if they're not human.
Yes, you could imagine the Telegraph reader saying, "Oh my gosh, darling, look, if we book into a hotel near Dover, we could be breathing the same air as a migrant."
Well, it's this thing of trying to make out that they are in some way dangerous, right? Any more dangerous than the rest of us, as if they're not human beings like the rest of us. It is, again, this us and them, divide and conquer rhetoric.
There's this whole dreamed up thing of, you know, these migrants are after your job, and well, that's it. You know, they're either after your job or they're claiming unemployment.
Yes, yeah, that's
exactly.
Right. Schrodinger's immigrant.
Exactly. A soon-to-be ministerial colleague of mine, he's a ministry student who was brought up in Poland and came here quite a few years back, is now a British citizen. But, you know, he was making the point that people like him actually save our system. I mean, even looking at under this from a capitalist perspective, they save our system a lot of money because Poland invested in his education, in his healthcare as a child, as a baby, as an infant, and you know, they pour this investment into him, and now he's gone, thank you very much, and he's taken all of that prior investment with him here. We haven't had to pay a penny for his education until up to the point that he came here. We haven't had to pay for his housing. We haven't had to pay benefits to his mother or family. And he's saved us money, as have, you know, every other immigrant. You know, even if you have to support them in housing, which most of them you don't, from a capitalist perspective, there's not a loss to be made from government coffers for migrants coming here. That just isn't.
And of course, obviously you and I will be very, very critical of the fact that that is the case in one sense, right? It should not be the case that, you know, we have to think of this primarily in capitalist terms, in terms of what,
totally,
you know, what it looks like. But by their own logic, it is nonsensical to conduct this war against immigrants. Obviously, there's more to a functioning capitalist system than, you know, the exchange of goods and services itself. You know, you need to have a scapegoat, and these are people who often are at their lowest ebb, you know, and it's easier to attack people who are already feeling it.
Totally. It's one of these illogical things about capitalism that to keep itself in place, it kind of hurts itself. It's like this sort of confused, aggressive snake that sort of is sort of forced by its own sort of dynamism and aggression to bite its own tail again.
Robin, you're here today because you sent us an essay and an order of service, and there's some really, really fascinating stuff in there. So we wanted to get you on to talk to us about some of that. First of all, the essay that you sent us explains a little bit about the history of Remembrance and the church, and you sort of try to frame things that are not traditionally seen as an issue of class struggle as being an issue of class struggle. So we're often taught to see things as, again, in this sort of us versus them, Brits versus Germans, or whatever. But you say that we should actually see it in terms of a class struggle. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, totally. I think particularly with Remembrance, the way it has always been presented by the establishment is something that transcends class. There's this very romanticised notion of working class Tommies were dying in the trenches alongside their, aristocratic officer comrades, and they were all doing it for Britain. And you can see it creates this idea of nationhood above class. And I mean, first of all, war under capitalism depends on that notion staying intact. This is why socialism should always hold to a principle of internationalism. That actually I, as a working class British person, have far more in common with a working class French person, a working class German person, a working class Russian person than a upper class or capitalist class British person. And the whole issue of Remembrance from a very early time has been completely averse to acknowledging any class differences. Something I quoted was this amazing quote by the Times in 1926, so on the 8th anniversary of Remembrance Day, and it kind of says the quiet part out loud. So they said, the leaders of powerful organisations among us who are prepared to wreck the constitution and destroy the absolutely essential trade in our country in the interests of a class war, and these deadly blows at the welfare of the nation have been struck when our vital industries are struggling to win for us our daily bread. To recover and hold against all rivals our place in the world markets is as necessary in the long run as it was in the great deliverance brought at the dear price of those who we commemorate today. Those lives were not given to leave open the way for strife and for class war. There was no class, there is none, for the dead who sleep side by side in Flanders or the Somme. For them, England and empire was supreme.
Wow.
That's it. That's it. We haven't. Our political establishment might have changed its language. It probably isn't as overt as that nowadays. But the idea of Remembrance still carries with it this sort of extreme nationalistic idea. Whereas I think a more radical form of remembrance is to remember those who died in, for example, the First World War as being victims of one of capitalism's more openly violent moments. Capitalism always maintains a level of violence, but it occasionally erupts into a kind of overt form in overt warfare. And the First World War, the tragedy of it was that it was a mass slaughter of the working class by the political bourgeois leadership of the countries engaged in it. Certainly, I think for that aspect, Marxists would do well to remember and commemorate those lives lost. Especially, of course, because tragically, not all of the left at the time of the First World War was against that war.
Yeah, I mean, I remember, I was reading the other day, and it was talking about how Malatesta had been critical of Kropotkin and said that he had forgotten his principles because he didn't oppose the war. And, I really like Kropotkin, but Malatesta's right.
Yeah.
That was a war that was based solidly in colonial exploitation and using the lives of working class people throughout the world, actually, to have those petty arguments, really, that then continued on into further exploitation and death when the lines on the maps were further redrawn. One of the things I find incredible about this kind of thing is whenever I go into a church, especially on a Remembrance Day service, and especially if it's a Church of England, I'm always amazed that I go in there and there are, Union flags hanging up everywhere, the national anthem is sung, and to me, I'm like, I cannot explain how profoundly offensive I think that is. Millions of people are sent off to die by the ruling classes, by the king, right? And to this day, we all sing God Save the King.
Totally.
It's like there's I don't know, like a juxtaposition, a complete mismatch between what happened and what we pretend happened.
Yeah, and I just think when you have these regimental flags, because these flags are honoured in the way they're displayed in churches, even when they become too tatty to actually show, there's a whole procedure that Church of England churches have to go through in order to essentially decommission these flags. Like there's lines and lines of procedure and paperwork you'd have to follow. Just preparing you there, Adam. That's the
Yeah, great. Yeah, thanks.
But and in Unitarian churches we don't do this as much. But I have preached in at least one Unitarian church with a Union flag beside the pulpit.
How was that for you?
It was genuinely. It was one of my most uncomfortable preaching experiences, which was unfortunate because the congregation themselves were lovely. I just think if you're going to have a national flag up in the sanctuary of your church, you might as well just erect a golden calf statue up the front and be done with it. It's
blasphemy. It is blasphemy, is what it is.
Yeah, and it's idolatry as well.
Yeah, completely.
It's incredibly offensive, and it should be offensive to all who come at these things from any kind of Christian perspective.
Yeah. And let's be clear on this as well, because, it's not that we are just two young-ish guys, getting on our high horse about this kind of thing and trying to find offence where veterans themselves don't take any. There has always been a strong undercurrent, and it is an undercurrent. It's, it's never been the biggest voice because it's not the voice that is promoted by the ruling class. But there's always been that undercurrent of people and of veterans themselves who fought both in the First and Second World Wars and other wars that has been saying exactly the same stuff that we're saying here, that it's offensive, that it's wrong. And you could see that in the war poetry as well, that we, I think probably most of us look at school and somehow seem to completely miss the point every time. How many of these war poets do we see where we read their poetry and it's talking about how bloody awful it all is and how these bastards sent us off to die? And, It's incredible because we have the audacity to have these services where we'll have the national anthem, we'll have flags everywhere, all of this. And then we'll also read some of those poems as well. And again, it's that complete mismatch, isn't it? And it's that a similar thing that always happens with sort of more radical voices is that their voices are appropriated by the ruling class and basically defanged. It's the same kind of thing that happened to Martin Luther King after he was murdered, was that, from then on, you've always had these liberals and conservatives talking about King's legacy and how he would have thought this and he would have thought that, completely ignoring any of the radical content of what he said. And we see that all the time. And this, how these war poets have been remembered or misremembered is exactly that same thing happening again.
And of course, it's always important to point out whenever Martin Luther King is mentioned, King was murdered as a direct consequence of his move that he was making at that point in his life to connect racial struggles with the capitalism, with the economic system itself.
Exactly.
And that was what was seen as dangerous by the authorities, and that was what had to be stopped. And again, it's people who die in these wars between capitalist nations, and as the Times at the time said, they died for British trade and industry. That was the establishment opinion of why that war was necessary. And to point that out is, still seen as political, still seen as, I'm sure some people would say that I am dishonouring the glorious memory of our war dead by pointing out why these poor people were killed. And it's a shame, and it's a more than a shame, it's a dangerous manipulation of history that the church should be incredibly hesitant about being drawn into, and has unfortunately been greatly complicit in this whole manufacturing establishment image of the First World War, almost since the whole idea of remembrance was first coined. There was ambivalence there. Not everything about remembrance traditions immediately got the church's approval, but there will be pressure, especially in a state church, to essentially fulfill that function of setting out capitalist cultural hegemony, of being that public presence at things like remembrance services that have often quite unwittingly sort of perpetuated this idea of war. And that's the thing that has to be resisted. I mean, truth is important. It's important for good theology, and it's important for Christianity to be able to speak truth to power.
So in your essay, you say that there's a pacifist theological critique of remembrance that offers some really interesting stuff, but ultimately I think you feel needs more. It falls down on certain things. And so you end up drawing from Herbert McCabe, and you've sort of hinted at some of that already. But I wonder whether you can talk to us first about, what are some of the good things that this pacifist theological critique bring to questions around remembrance, and what are some of the limitations of that? And so where do we go from that as well?
I should say, I don't consider myself a pacifist. When those with economic power under capitalism are challenged, they're going to resort to violence in order to defend that position. And I think I wouldn't want to write off any form of resistance before then. That said, that's a very, in a sense, technical objection to pacifism. I think I have far more in common with pacifists today than I have against them. So I don't take necessarily an anti-pacifist stance. And in fact, I think Christian pacifists have been crucial in pointing out the links with modern remembrance traditions and militarism. So it's been a great way for political elites to put people in uniform into the public sphere, to organise things like flight paths and these sort of militaristic displays, which don't really do anything to explain the stories of those who have fallen in war or in battle, or to show the immense suffering that war necessarily entails. But do show this sort of military triumphalistic stance, which is very useful for them. And you kind of see this more overtly now in things like Armed Forces Day. But of course, Remembrance has kind of filled a lot of the function of Armed Forces Day. And pacifism quite rightly points out the inherent contradictions of this, and does a very good job in doing so. My critique of that is that you very rarely get that stance combined with a class perspective. And I think that is something that Herbert McCabe's theology does really well. For those who don't know, Herbert McCabe, OP is Order of Preachers. Herbert McCabe was a Dominican monk and theologian who was mostly based in Blackfriars College in Oxford. But he wrote this phenomenal book chapter called The Class Struggle and Christian Love. And I just appeal to all listeners, if you are a Christian and a leftist in any form, read that book chapter.
We should say as well, it is actually available online at the moment for free at the Bias magazine. So yeah, if you go to christiansocialism.com, you can get that for free.
Have you heard of Krishna consciousness?
This part is a crazy man.
Do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
Right, that'll work.
A new and better life awaits you on our distant home planet, Blistonia.
Makes sense.
We're having a free get-acquainted session at a resort this weekend.
How much is this free resort weekend?
It's free.
And when is this weekend?
It's this weekend.
Uh-huh. And how much does it cost?
It's free.
I see. And when is it?
It's this weekend.
And what are you charging for this free weekend?
Come on, Dad, the team's arriving.
It's free, right?
As I was saying earlier about the whole idea of capitalism being a state of violence, that is something that McCabe expresses really well in that chapter. He says that capitalism is a state of war, but not a state of war between equivalent forces. It involves war between those who believe in and prosecute war as a way of life, as an economy, and those who do not. The permanent capitalist state of war erupts every now and again into a killing war, but its so-called peacetime is just war carried on by other means. And I think that's the crucial thing. Capitalism continues to commit acts of social murder against the working class on a daily basis, the world over. And it does so through acts of violence. It doesn't necessarily involve overt killing, although often it does, but acts like, say, the disaster at Grenfell Tower, that is capitalist society creating an environment that is dangerous for working class people to live in and exist in by design.
It's probably worth saying that it doesn't even have to be as extreme an example of that, right? Or what we don't consider to be, as extreme an example of that. Homelessness is an example of it. Drug criminalisation is an example of it. There are literally so many. I mean, cutting people's benefits, privatising the NHS. These are all ways in which the class war is kind of perpetuated by the bourgeois class to if not to kill people directly, then those are the results of it regardless.
Yes. I mean, trapping us in a state of wage slavery whereby as a consequence we suffer things like stress in our workplaces and because of our work.
Well, alienation.
Yes, exactly. Alienation itself. These things do shorten our lives and deteriorate the quality of our lives. These are anti-life policies of capitalism.
Well, it's capitalism is a death cult, isn't it?
Exactly. And I think that would be my philosophy of remembrance, because remembrance for me is a way in to these critiques, because we make time to remember those who fell victim to these horrible, ghastly times when the undercurrent of violence inherent in capitalism broke through the surface and formed, as McCabe calls it, a killing war. So this Remembrance season is a fantastic time to remember those who lost their lives in these wars, and to also maybe begin to think about those who lose their lives in the violence of apparent peacetime, again to capitalist violence, to in fact lose their lives to the class war. And I'm sorry to be a downer about it, but as the left, we are losing daily. Capitalists are very good at killing people, and we're not. We're not good at fighting wars. And I don't want to be good at fighting wars. I don't want to be violent, but that is the daily reality of capitalism, is one of violence. And every day that passes where we aren't working for revolution is a day where this violence gets cemented needlessly.
I wanted to quote a part of your essay. As I said before we started recording, not to test you on it, but because it felt to me like a really important piece. So you said in this essay, it is this contradiction of remembrance between those who capitalism consigns slowly but surely to a nameless grave, and those who it ferociously and violently wipes out in a matter of seconds, that a radical public theology can overcome. As such, the solution to the problems of remembrance is not to tone down the importance of the occasion, but to radically expand it to include all victims of capitalism and its consequences. I found that absolutely fascinating, because there are going to be a lot of people who would hear that or read that and actually probably take offence at that. How dare you take remembrance and, apply it to something other than the fallen men and women, mainly from the world wars and from subsequent conflicts. But I think it's this idea that you're talking about from Herbert McCabe about these just being the killing wars. And so what I wanted to know was, what are some of the practical ways you think that we could do that? What sort of, how do you approach the season of remembrance with that in mind?
Yeah, something I learnt, I think, since writing that essay was that not all of the names on war memorials are actually the names of people who died in the conflict itself. This is a very interesting thing that historians of remembrance have picked up on in recent years, that actually people who survived either of the two world wars, who came back, sometimes lived for maybe 20 years afterwards and then died, actually had their names added to the memorials. So if a complaint against my stance is that by broadening out remembrance so far we are dishonouring those who fell in war, remembrance has never been strictly about those who just died in a war. And it should never be about just those who died in a war. War has far more negative consequences than just death. Those who go to war and have terrible mental health issues afterwards, because of course, why would you not have terrible mental health issues afterwards? I hope nobody is so well adjusted to outright violence that they can keep their sanity in these things. And most veterans I know who have been involved in recent conflicts have had to go through therapy afterwards, because that is what happens when a healthy human brain is exposed to that violence. It will cause issues. So we should obviously take remembrance to remember these veterans as well. But also, of course, causing bad mental health is not just a situation in capitalism that is unique to warfare. As we've discussed, that is a daily consequence of living with the violence of the capitalist system on a daily basis, that rather than medical treatment for a few or a nice luxury for some, mental health care is actually now increasingly being seen correctly as something that all people should have access to. And I'm sure, Adam, you would have come across this. You would have get a lot of people saying that as a priest in training, you should be accessing some form of spiritual direction or possibly a talking therapy as well. I foolishly have not acted on that advice as yet, so I do need to find a spiritual director or a talking therapist soon. But again, that is a consequence of the violence of the system. The difference is, of course, if you have fought in, I was going to say a war, but actually, of course, it's some wars. We choose to remember veterans from some wars and not others, and again, that is a political choice. But I include in this essay somebody who does this fantastic sort of little mini ethnographic study of a cemetery. And of course, you have these sort of grand war memorials, but then you also, in other parts of the cemetery, have the paupers' graves, which are unmarked, where we don't remember their lives. And I think my point is that we should try and bridge the gap between those who have been killed in outright overt violence, or those who have suffered as a consequence of that outright overt violence, and those who have suffered in that violence of everyday life that we have all too sadly grown accustomed to.
Yeah, and you also, in your sermon that you gave in the Remembrance service that you sent over to me, included some recollections by a veteran called Dr. Reginald Saxton.
Yes.
Can you tell me a little bit about Reginald Saxton and why you chose to include his reflections?
I knew him briefly. He was very old at the time and I was very young, but I knew him briefly. And Reginald Saxton was a veteran of the Spanish Civil War. He was a young doctor who volunteered to go and fight against fascism in Spain with the International Brigades. And earlier I said that Remembrance tradition in Britain, officially speaking, remembers veterans of some wars and not others. Unfortunately, veterans of the Spanish Civil War are missed out, or rather sort of purposely forgotten from remembrance quite often. And these are people who volunteered to go and fight fascism. There was no state saying that they must. And of course, they were also some of the first people to experience the horrors of modern urban warfare. So different from trench warfare.
Which, church warfare can be very brutal, but not quite as bad as trench warfare.
No, absolutely. But trench warfare, of course, mostly involved signed up combatants, soldiers from two sides. The urban warfare in the Spanish Civil War in some ways departed from this. You were getting warfare in urban centres where civilians were still trying to live their lives. If you look at images of the Spanish Civil War, you will find an awful lot in common aesthetically with images from the war in Ukraine, where you have bombings, firing taking place in a arena where you will still have civilians trying to scuttle back home with their shopping bags. In either of those theatres of war, you'll see the horrible effect that has on civilians. And Reginald Saxon was one of the people who saw this for the first time. And of course, the Spanish Civil War veterans, when they came back to Britain, were the people who were responsible for training the Home Guard with the urban guerrilla war tactics which they had first learnt and pioneered and encountered. And of course, as a doctor, Reginald would have, in fact, he did see at first hand the great horrors of war.
About blood groups and this sort of thing. I got that, fortunately, as a student, I got that well fixed in my mind, all about what was known then about blood groups. But the actual mechanics of giving blood, I had this one experience, which was very fortunate I had that much. There's a great deal more than having none at all. And but my instruments were so primitive. So anyway, I rigged it up. I had a cannula, which by cutting down on a vein, I could insert into a vein. And this is what I had to do. And I had a long rubber tube and a funnel. So I delivered the blood into the patient by pouring it into a funnel. It came down a tube and went through a cannula into the patient's vein. And it worked. It worked very well, but of course it was a bit tedious and troublesome, and sterilizing wasn't, well, too easy or even too perfect, but still we just had to wash it out and boil it up and do it again. And this is how I was transfusing our severely exsanguinated patients. I can remember one poor devil, he was bleeding out practically as fast as I was putting it in, though I didn't know because he was bleeding in the lungs. I remember this poor devil, he felt so much better having had one transfusion, which I put, in fact, in this case, into his arm. I didn't often cut down. Usually one cuts down on the ankle. Well, usually. One used to. So I gave him this one transfusion in one arm, and he felt so much better, but he could feel that he was, going just the same. So he said, "Can I have another in this arm?" Well, what can I do? I only had a very limited amount of blood and so many people needing it. He died, like so many others.
Something I hate about remembrance services in church is often the recollections of veterans are completely whitewashed and sanitised. Something that Reginald Saxon wrote back to the Lancet about was his experiments of being forced to use cadaver blood for blood transfusions.
Oh, wow.
It would be blood transfusion from bodies or body parts. Because that if the blood stocks run low and, a shell hit a Republican position, then you had to use what you had to use. Of course, the amount of people who were saved by this was very few. It's not a go-to medical procedure now, but the results of this are still taught to medical practitioners who practice in theatres of war. There is sometimes cause when, these things will be considered. I do mention that in my sermon. And actually, I mean, this is something where even those on the left, including myself, with the Spanish Civil War, sometimes we can whitewash it ourselves because, of course, for us, this was very much a just war. This wasn't a war of a state. This was a war from communists and anarchists recruiting people on a class basis throughout Europe to join in a spirit of solidarity. To fight against fascism. I mean, what cause could be more noble than that? But sometimes I think we on the left are actually guilty of, not giving the horrors that were encountered their airtime in exchange for this sort of slightly more sanitized remembrance.
And actually some of the horrors that were perpetrated by people on the side that we would identify with as well. War is an awful, awful thing, and the lines of morality can seem to shift at those times, rightly or wrongly, and so we know some of the horrors that happened, and I think it's really important for us to be reminded of those and to learn from them and try and make sure that we minimise those kinds of things in the future.
Absolutely. And I should say, because I have my critiques of pacifism, I don't believe the pacifist position today is gravely mistaken. Far from it. I think in a moment of sudden revolution, it could be gravely mistaken. But, until then, I'm very much on the side of the pacifists. War is never something that should be longed for. And even revolutionary violence, I'd say that the longest lasting, most secure revolutions have actually been the ones that have been least bloody, where actually the revolutionary work was done through educating the majority of people via peaceful means first. And that's something we should never lose sight of either. In the political left, you do get this sometimes a sort of fetishization of revolutionary violence, and that's dangerous.
You've only got to look at the number of guillotine memes, and honestly, I've laughed at guillotine memes,
Yes, of course. And I mean, the Coos song, Bring Out the Guillotine, it's a comic song featuring a guillotine. You should look that up and listen to it as well. But sometimes maybe we on the left can be a bit too sort of slapdash and comic about such things. The point of a revolution is not to kill capitalists, it is to liberate them from the position of being a capitalist.
Although, of
ideally,
course, the French Revolution was a liberal revolution.
Totally.
So, when you see leftists sort of sharing guillotine memes all the time, I some of them are quite funny, but equally, it's worth remembering what happened after that. It was not the case that we, ended up in France with a radical kind of socialist society at all. And I think we should probably remember that a bit more.
Yeah, it's important to note that these bourgeois revolutions lent on the support of working people and encouraged them in their revolt. But of course, when these ideas got too dangerous, the common people, they were stamped out pretty quickly.
Last question, because we are running rapidly out of time. I wanted to sort of give some sort of biblical contextualization to this. How do we, you say you're not a pacifist, and I think, probably a majority of Christians in this country aren't pacifists. What are some of the kind of theological ideas that, or even sort of scriptures that underpin your own position?
I think, really, for me, it's the way that Jesus resists imperialist Rome. And it was through methods that a lot of people would have critiqued at the time for being far too subtle. But I think that actually these were effective. For example, the verse in Scripture about you should carry somebody's pack for 2 miles when they ask you to carry it for a mile. This was Jesus actually recommending to his followers an act of civil disobedience. People don't realise this. There was a thing in imperialist Rome and militaries that the idea was that you could pull somebody out of their work in the fields, and they could carry your pack, and you would tell them to do it for a mile, and then you'd get somebody else, some other poor guy in the next village along, to do the same. And it was this constant sort of beating down of working people. And it had real material circumstances, because if you have to take time out of your work to walk a mile with this big heavy pack, and then you have to walk back again, that's a fair amount of time of work that you have missed. That could make the difference between whether your family had enough to eat or not that night. So the act of saying, no, I'm going to carry this for 2 miles, means that actually you save your brother the same treatment that you are receiving. So as a tactic, beating down the common people in these occupied regions into submission, the effectiveness of that tactic has been halved. So it's these passages of scripture that encourage solidarity as a form of resistance against imperial powers, which are hugely important to me.
Yeah, and I think when we realise that they're existing in a colonial context, depending on what the context is, a number of different tactics may be required. It's not necessarily the case that just because a non-violent or pacifist tactic is used in one place and in one context, that it should therefore be used in every place and every context.
That's a great point. As a lot of revolutionary strategists will say, there's 2 things you have to keep in mind. There's your perspectives on what is going on politically, economically, how is this developing, what is the outlook of things, what are your perspectives for revolution within that, and that's scientifically formed for a careful materialist analysis. But tactics, on the other hand, are an art form. Yes, you can look at examples from history, but at the end of the day, you have to retain a position of being incredibly flexible in your tactics. If you adhere to them too rigidly, a revolutionary class will just move by themselves and just pass you by as a complete irrelevance. So gain inspiration from the tactics that movements have used in history, absolutely. And you should study them because you might need to employ them. But if you pick 1 or 2 that you adhere rigidly to, history will just move on without you, I'm afraid.
I think that's right. Robin, we've run out of time. Thank you so much for joining me. It's been, really fascinating getting your outlook on this stuff. Is there anywhere in the world we can find you, or anything you want to point us to?
Yeah, my Twitter profile's always worth a follow, at Robin Hanford, because, that's how my autistic imagination works with picking out usernames. And I have a website as well, which is hanford.me.uk. And I really need to update that. A few of my sermons appear on there. Maybe this essay that we've been referring to probably needs to go up on there too, so we can direct listeners to it. But if you want to see more updates appearing on there, hanford.me.uk is the place to go.
And that takes us to the end of this time's edition of Rosaries Rewind. Thank you very much for Robin for joining us. It's a really fascinating episode. I've found it really interesting to listen back to. Thank you as always for listening. Thank you for holding with us while we took a little bit of break from recording. As I said earlier, we are back now, so looking forward to being back on something approaching a normal release schedule. As always, we love to hear from people, so if you want to get in touch with us, all our contact details are breadandrosaries.com. There's also links to the Patreon if you want to throw us a few pennies so that we can host and record this podcast. That would be fantastic. Apparently reviews as well on whatever podcast app you use is really helpful, and share this with people you think might be interested. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.